Greetings and welcome to the Vortex. I'm your host, Daniel Allen Jones, and I'm joined by legendary Peter Robbins. Peter.
Hi, Daniel.
Glad to be here with you.
Me too.
So we've been talking about the subject of UFOs here at the conference all week long, the many different facets that are involved with this field of study, and you've been a very long-time researcher in uncovering many different parts of this phenomenon and showing us that there's much more than meets the eye, and sometimes we consider that truth may be stranger than fiction. So please bring us back and share with us how you first got involved with this field and some of your early studies.
Sure. I was born in New York City and have lived most of my life there. As a youngster, though, our folks moved me and my sister, I had another sister after, out to Long Island, to an idyllic little village about 30 miles east of New York City, Manhattan. And that's where I came of age, in a way with the best of two worlds. Small town growing up experience and Manhattan 30 miles away. I had no interest whatsoever in UFOs as a subject growing up. It's a much more innocent time. I was a kid who was a Boy Scout and collected stamps and a lot of old-fashioned stuff like that. I guess my only contact with the subject was I'm old enough to have seen in first run a lot of the old great B movies, science fiction movies that I'd go to the local theater, the Fantasy Theater in Rockville Center, Long Island, with some of my nerdy friends, and Saturday afternoon with a giant eyeball or monster spider or creatures from other planets. I think I must have intuited that in the adult world, this was a subject that wasn't taken seriously. Mm-hmm. And again, it wasn't a subject I was really interested in. Everything changed, though, on a late June morning in the early 60s when one of my sisters and I were out in front of the house we grew up in playing, goofing around as kids do, on an idyllic late spring, early summer morning. And I think anybody that grows up in a small town knows those times where there's not only nothing going on around you, there's nothing going on around you.
Yeah.
No other kids are playing, cars aren't going by, no ice cream truck. You just got it to yourself. I don't remember what we were talking about or doing, but we were standing about 6 feet apart, and I caught something out of my right peripheral vision. And I should tell you here that the events I'm going to relate, I put out of my mind because they were so difficult. They became my repressed memory from childhood, and it was not for more than 14 years that they came roaring back.
Oh, wow.
At which point the memories were very conscious and real and confirmable with my sister. However, I can also tell you that after this awakening, so to say, in order to confirm my experience for myself, I underwent hypnotic regression on 3 occasions with 3 different practitioners. So I can say with some assuredness that this is the way it was. I catch some movement, and I either say, Helen, or look. And there, coming in at a high rate of speed and stopping over the neighbor's house, were 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects. Oval, like holding a pie plate at an angle, away from you. They were in a precise military kind of V formation. And they weren't shiny metal like, say, stainless steel, but we could read that they were metallic, more like, say, brushed aluminum. They were also close enough that we could make out regular detailing around the edge of each, which again, many years later, in comparing notes, the only thing that both of us, either of us could compare it to, was seeing windows on a commercial airplane at an appreciable distance. Well, at that moment, I went through a reaction that I have since documented, I'm sure, with 100, 200 people around the world in the intervening decades. I call it the checklist reaction, and it's very simple. You're minding your own business, living your life, and you look up and you see a thing or things that are unlike anything you've ever seen before, and your logical, rational mind clicks off everything they're not. It's not planes, kites, balloons, helicopters, blimps, strange-shaped clouds, reflections from the ground, birds. What am I looking at? And all I could think was, these look like flying saucers from the science fiction movies I've seen.
Oh, wow.
But I know they're not real, because that's sort of what the adult world says.
Yeah.
I have to stress here, there were no appendages of any sort. No wings, no tail. They were ovals. And they just hung there in the sky without a sound. I had a moment I'll describe now for other people who might be the exact opposite of, oh my God, they're real and I'm connected to the universe and everything bigger. For me, I had a moment of cosmic loneliness. Life, in a second, had yanked a rug out from under me, and all of a sudden, everything I thought I knew was open to question.
Yeah.
If this was real, then anything might be possible. And I was very uncomfortable with it. Why? Like a lot of little kids growing up, I longed for things to be different. I wanted to be one of the cool kids. I wanted to have really cool clothes, better hair, a foot taller, and a girlfriend, not necessarily in that order. I was 14 years old. My life was essentially being run by my hormones. And I'm only half joking when I tell you, I thought if I tell any of my geeky little friends from junior high school about this, they're going to tell somebody else, and sooner or later a girl's going to find out about it.
Oh, no.
And this wonderful thing that I've been looking forward to called sex, every girl in the world's going to know about it, they're all going to laugh at me, and it's never going to happen. Again, this is the way I was thinking. And I struggled. I really struggled. I'm going to compress the story some. But essentially, after they were there, Helen and I never had an accurate count on it, but it wasn't quick. A minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, which is forever in this kind of time.
Sure.
We didn't say a word to each other. And at a certain point, I had it. My anxiety was that peaked. I have had people in retelling this story have said to me, oh, surely nothing could have taken you away from this. This is the most amazing thing you've ever seen. If it were me, I would have taken my eyes off those things till they left. This is the most amazing moment of my life. Well, that's how anxious I was.
Yeah.
And I peeled off and went running into the house to tell our mom, who was in the kitchen making us lunch. Within 2 or 3 seconds, I'm making a beeline across the lawn, I felt something very dramatic happened to me. I felt like I was running through molasses or honey. Everything in the universe slowed down.
Oh, wow.
No fear, just fascination. And I became so focused on it that I forgot about the things in the sky. That's ridiculous. But that is part of the pattern.
Yeah.
There's no logic to it. They control a certain amount of it. One way or another, I went down. I passed out. I was knocked out. When the memory returned, I wanted to think it was a minute or two. It was probably considerably longer. If in that time cars did go by, they might not have seen me. I was lying flat out on our front lawn coming in toward the walkway. And at a certain point I woke up, looked around, they're not there, my sister's not there, and I'm feeling a pulsation in my right forearm. And I look, and I've scraped myself. Obviously, things hadn't slowed down, it was an illusion. But I skidded into the sidewalk and I had scraped there. In hypnotic regression, people experience it in different ways. My most effective one, and I was fortunate in having good practitioners and in waiting until I was good and ready. I was told I was a very good subject. I went into alpha very deeply, and I wasn't observing this from some neutral point. I was 14 again, and it was amazing.
Wow. I
knew somewhere in my consciousness that I'm reliving this, but I didn't want anything to disturb it. I was thinking the thoughts of a 14-year-old. I was not wearing sneakers. I was wearing my Keds. T-shirts were called polo shirts back then for some reason. And a 14-year-old boy's reality. I look at it, and my thought is, and I say it, what a scab that's going to be.
Yeah.
I mean, for a boy, red badge of courage, right?
Yeah.
Pick myself up, go into the house. Intuitively, I walk up the stairs. There's my sister in her bedroom with her back to me, looking reflectively out the window into her backyard. Private moment, leave her alone. I walk around through the living room, dining room, and I stand where the dining room meets the kitchen. And there's my mother in right profile. I think she was making grilled cheese sandwiches in a frying pan on the stove. Many years later, when we discussed this with our parents, my mom didn't remember it, but her reaction, I wish every parent who had a child come in and tell them something like I was going to tell my mom, was the same. Or an adult reflecting back on, gee, I wish I hadn't let my anxiety run that moment, and say, oh, honey, it just looked like that, but really it couldn't have been because we know that.
Sure.
I said, quote unquote, Mom, Helen and I just saw some things in the sky over the Parker's house that looked like flying saucers from the movies. And my mom turned and she looked at me for a number of seconds with a serious look on her face. And I thought, this is the way grown-ups look at each other. And she managed to simply get it and not feel the necessity to say anything about it, and went back to cooking with a somewhat serious look on her face. In hypnosis, I should add, at a certain point, this one with Bud Hopkins, he said, what time is it? I don't know. Is there a clock in the kitchen? Yes. Where is the clock? On the wall up to the right from my mom. Look at the clock. What time is it? 20 after 12. It works like that sometimes.
Yeah.
Right after lunch, I got on my bike and I headed to a village library, and for the only time in my life, I took out a couple of books on flying saucers. The only time in my life, because once I got seriously interested as an adult, I just simply started to build a library.
Sure.
What I was looking for was some grown-up books that would tell me that what I had seen was explainable in conventional terms. This was the 1960s. Most libraries had quite a number of books on the subject at the time. It was before there was a certain amount of ridicule factor in the library world, and a lot of libraries dumped their books in book sales.
Oh.
If you were lucky at the time, you pick up some classics for 35 cents or whatever. But I grabbed them, put them in my bike, went home, went up to my room, closed the door, and looked at them. One was worse than the other. The first one was my trip to Neptune with the Green Men.
Oh, yeah.
The second one, I actually remembered the cover because it was so iconic. It was a book called Flying Saucers Have Landed by a man named George Adamski, who was a leader of the 60s contactee movement, and a man named Desmond Leslie, who was a career scientist who went on to become a respected scientist. I just wanted to get them the hell out of the house.
Yeah.
But it was too late. I took them back to the library the next day. Over that afternoon or that evening, my sister came up to me and said, do you want to talk about this? I looked at her and said that one magic word that changed things, which was no. And the days started to roll into weeks and the weeks into years. I could not accept what I had seen. It was simply too much. And the implications were too much. And so I did something that now I understand, this phenomena of repressed memory syndrome. I would expect that phrase wasn't in the lexicon at the time in the world of mental health profession. But within about 2 weeks, Daniel, I managed to put it out of my mind so completely that over the next 14 and a half years, absolutely, I take that back, one thing. Nothing rattled it loose until about 1966 when I had my first LSD experience. The 60s are just kicking in. I was part of it. LSD was not illegal in the United States at that time.
Oh, yeah.
What I had was Sandoz Pharmaceutical, the Swiss company that manufactured it, and I had a very positive, amazing experience. And somewhere in there, I had a distorted memory. I did a watercolor And some years later came upon it, and it disturbed me so much that I tore it up.
Oh no.
And life went on. And that memory remained submerged. Now I'm well into my 20s. I'm following my dream. I'm an aspiring painter in New York City. I have a loft in New York's Chinatown. I'm teaching at my alma mater, the School of Visual Arts. I'm living, eating, and breathing the art world. My day job when I was working was part of a construction team in the so-called Soho building boom, when that warehouse district in Lower Manhattan was being turned into an art center, and huge old industrial lots were being turned into galleries and amazing apartments and things. I taught painting at the School of Visual Arts, and one afternoon, the memory came roaring back. I think it was a number of factors conspired to have that memory return at that time. Probably the most significant one is I was ready to deal with it. But within a matter of 10 minutes or so, tops, there it was. I'm reliving the thing like a film loop. I can't shut it off. And my reaction was, I thought I was going crazy, because my logical mind said, there is no way in hell that any sane person could have made themselves forget this. And I kind of broke down, sitting on the floor of my loft and just lost. I finally calmed down. I think the thing through, have a cup of tea. What do I do? Only one thing to do is telephone my sister and ask her if she has the same memory. I was perceptive enough to realize if I just called her and I said, Helen, I just had this memory of something that happened to us as kids. This is the memory, do you remember it? I would never know in my heart for sure if she had the same memory. She'd say yes or no. So I called her, asked her if it was a good time to talk. She lived a mile or so north of me in the East Village, aspiring poet, living in a walk-up tenement. And I said, is this a good time to talk? She said, no. I said, I've had a memory from childhood has returned, and I need to know if you remember the same thing.
Yeah.
And she told me basically what I've just told you. The one permutation difference was she wasn't sure whether it was 5 or 6, which we worked out the next day, because after we got off the phone, I did my first painting of UFOs. I did many, many, many drawings in the years that followed, but it was simply as realistic a painting of what we had seen with one extra one, so that there were 6.
Oh, okay.
So that the next day I could go up to her place, bring the thing, put my hand over here, and say, was it this or was it that? And it was that. It was 5, because we both remembered that it was a symmetrical V, meaning it would have to have been. At that point, I had a moment of absolutely a schizophrenic kind of reaction, in a way completely split. At the same time as I thought, oh my God, they're real and it really happened, I thought, oh my God, they're real and it really happened.
Yeah, wow.
Then Helen said, but there's more, and I'm not sure how you're going to deal with it in so many words. And then proceeded to tell me something that completely changed my life forever. As an investigative writer specializing in the subject of UFOs for more than 40 years, well, about that, but somebody whose interest goes back that far, I have spoken to hundreds of people who seem to have had what we call UFO abduction experiences.
Yeah.
And the patterning is very, very tight in many cases. At the time, even within the world of UFO studies, abduction research was in its almost pre-infancy. In popular culture, the Betty and Barney Hill case was known. Mm-hmm. It had happened in '61 to a couple in New Hampshire. It became public in '65. It was in Life magazine and things. But other than that, there wasn't much about this subject, and I had certainly never seen anything about it. But my sister proceeded to tell me, in flashes of conscious recalled memory, being lifted off the ground, knowing I had passed out, and going up. Again, this makes no sense, but absolutely with no fear. Complete fascination. 12-year-old girl, wind blowing her hair,
Yeah.
looking for the first and last time in her life at the roof of our house getting smaller, at the bottom of these things getting bigger. The next thing she knows, she's in a curved metal hallway being walked through by 7 or 8 beings that she described to me in the terminology she developed at 12 years old for them. Little doctors with big heads and big black eyes who talk to me in my head.
Wow.
The term gray, which is now ubiquitous in the culture
Sure.
as a type, was still several decades away from emerging.
Oh, sure.
And then she's on a table, a metal table, no clothes, and one large one, scaled up kind of gray. And she is the procedure is going on. There is some fear, but basically, and then the voice in the head. You're special. We've seen you before. We'll see you again. We love you. We will not hurt you. Word for word in some cases, these are what people report.
Yeah.
And where things became a conflict for her, and where it informed a lot of her later life. At that moment where the voice said, "We will not hurt you," she was experiencing pain from what they were doing. Well, I was gobsmacked. I had never heard anything like this in my life. I have to stress here that maybe more than a lot of siblings, my sister and I were incredibly close growing up. I have another sister I love very much, couldn't love her more, but Helen and I were very close in age and less so. As adults, we were both artists. We were both writers. We, over the years, shared apartments together, private house. We were best friends to a degree. We edited each other's work. We shared friends, dated each other's friend. My sister was an honest person. She had no reason to lie about this or to confabulate it. I immediately sensed whatever happened to her, she was relating it as authentically as she could.
Yeah.
You know, Daniel, people use that catchphrase sometimes, my life changed overnight. Mine changed in about 30 seconds.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And the initial impact, and even to a degree now, was one I did not like. I was one of those lucky kids growing up. I was good at something, and it was reinforced by the adult world. I knew what I wanted to do, and I was now living that dream. I was going to be a successful New York-based artist, make money, be famous, travel around to shows of my work and things. I was working on it. And all of a sudden, something interceded in my life. Much as I hated the fact and resented it, it was more important than what I was doing. I continued for quite a number of years to teach painting, to work, although what I was working at, the images I was creating as an artist changed dramatically, but something had essentially torn the heart out of the dream. This is not somebody somewhere thinking about being an artist. This is being in New York City. I had studied with people whose work was in museums. I had met famous artists. I was part of that scene. And although I continued to play the role, the heart had gone out of it. I still resent it to a degree. But that is the long answer to your short question. And the next thing I know, I wake up kind of some years later and I realize, good Lord, this is what you're doing. This is the path that you're following for whatever reasons. And then wake up years after that and say, how did this happen?
Yeah.
I'm now well known and respected in a field I had no intention of entering. And I'm good at what I do. And people respect my work overall. And how about that? I should say I'm now, all these years later, realizing for a number of reasons I need to get back to what I was doing. And so over this next year I will begin to paint and draw again. Even that posed a philosophical question. Where do you begin after stopping all those years?
Yeah, sure.
And then the answer came up and it was so obvious. I'm beginning exactly where I left off years ago and moving forward from there.
Well, that's excellent. I think it's something that many people sometimes don't get the opportunity to do. They feel that they've grown into one facet and they just have to sink into that for the rest of their life or career.
That's right.
But it can be a sort of rebirth or a sort of a refreshing feeling of something that's been with you for so long, but you haven't been active with in a long time. So it's great to see that you're going to be working more than that. I would like for you to share a bit about your work with Bud Hopkins, because this is something you mentioned earlier, and I think that's going to be a really fascinating part of how this all came together. Could you share a little bit about how that happened?
Sure. For your viewers who are not familiar with his name, if you Google Bud Hopkins, Bud with 2 Ds, you'll get like a zillion hits. Bud was a respected New York painter, considerably older than me, entering the field as what we would call a late period abstract expressionist, but also became fascinated by this subject through his own not experience as much as a life event of relating to somebody who had had an experience, although he had had a sighting earlier. And he emerged as, I think, the undisputed leader of the area of study, and in ufology as well as almost any area of study, there are lots of subdivisions.
Yeah.
But the scientific study of the abduction phenomena was something he pioneered. I'm now about a year into the work, which for me means reading obsessively, starting to build that part of my library, beginning to put together newspaper clippings, keep notebooks. Almost all of the newspaper articles that I was collecting at that time were tabloid. One of the ironies there is that, it's the National Enquirer. We now know that the National Enquirer in the area of UFO reports got a lot of it right, but it just sounded like silly tabloid fodder, and so that was that. Well, I'm now, again, a practicing painter. I'm teaching at a great art school. I'm walking down the street one day, and I walk by a newsstand, and I do a double take, because Front Page, no longer in print, but a longtime New York newspaper called The Village Voice, which was mostly a liberal political weekly. But Front Page is an article about a UFO event that happened the year before in New Jersey. I buy it, of course, take it home and read it. I was struck by the fact that it was the best case laid out that I had ever read as such, that it was really well written, and that the New York art world is a fairly small place if you're in it. And I remember the name Bud Hopkins, Bud with 2 Ds, having seen some of his work in a group show sometime before that, and I thought, could this be the painter? Actually, I have to say I don't remember whether that little box in the article that sometimes accompanies, an article might have said, Bud Hopkins is a painter. I don't remember. All I knew is I had to meet this guy.
Yeah.
I got hold of the New York phone book. It was the day we all had one. Huge thing. Bang, there it is. Only one Bud Hopkins. I called him. Hi, Mr. Hopkins. You don't know me. I'm a painter. I teach at the School of Visual Arts. I just read your article. I thought it was great. I have a serious interest in the subject of UFOs. I had a sighting as a kid. And my sister Helen seems to have had an experience. Being a good artist, his very first question to me was, tell me about your art.
Yeah.
Didn't go well. I was coming out of the tradition of minimal and conceptual art. He was much more traditional, but he let it go. He was interested in Helen's experience, and why don't you come over in a couple of days, we'll have coffee together. Whatever it was, I show up at his home, a nondescript little 4-story gray building in Chelsea, district in New York, the Lower West Side, and ring the bell. This very affable guy comes to the door, escorts me upstairs, and we sit at his kitchen table and have a cup of coffee and talk about art, life, and UFOs, mostly about UFOs and art. And, it's so funny. In life, there are moments that you don't identify as they're happening, as being absolutely paramount and life-changing. I could never have imagined that over the next 35 years, I would have hundreds of cups of coffee at that table with that guy.
Wow, yeah.
Quite a number of shots of scotch along the way, too. that he would become one of the most influential people in my life, one of my dearest friends, and a true mentor. Bud was still 5 years away from publishing his first UFO book. He had written, that was his very first article or paper on UFOs, and for what it's worth, as a newbie, it was recognized by the major UFO organization, the Mutual UFO Network, or better known as MUFON, as a superbly documented case that he continued to document, and they named it the case of the year. So he was on his way in that field, continued to paint, and our friendship started to grow over the next few years. We'd get together like every couple of months, coffee, go to an exhibit or something, chat. We had a lot of other interests in common. Bud was a great intellect. He loved New York City, his adopted home, grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, graduated from Oberlin College with a BFA in 1959, at a time when a young painter could move to New York with not much money, real estate didn't rent for much or cost much, and follow your dream, which he did. Then came his first book, Missing Time, which is, as I recall, 7 case studies of people who were taken and returned. And one of the presenting signs, one of the things that accompanied each event, was a period of missing time, usually coming in at about an hour and a half that you could not account for. Well, the book not only gave serious UFO studies a new important volume, and a very important book on a subject within UFO studies that was still just being explored, but it gave the English language a new phrase. Even people that could care less about UFOs or not familiar with the subject generally understand that missing time refers to a paranormal UFO type event.
Yeah.
At that point, his profile in the work was elevated, and the mail started coming in. I'm now half a dozen years into the work. About the time that he came out, here's another thing. The year after we met, in 1977, I'm keeping notebooks. I'm trying to learn everything I can about this subject, and I thought, I want to talk about this subject in some public forum. Hey, I'm on a faculty of a recognized educational institution, and it's an art school, so they're a bit out of the box. I know that they're always looking for interesting speakers. I went to Dr. Silas Rhodes, the founder of the School of Visual Arts and the director, and said, I'm into this subject now. I've got a friend who's also a painter who's into it. He knew who Bud was. And how about giving us a shot at giving a talk for the student body and faculty? Didn't get paid. It was just a thing we did. He brought the witness with him of his first case, and an old school UFO researcher named Dick Rule, R-H-U-L, I think, who was a player with NICAP, the big UFO organization before MUFON. And so Bud and I gave our very first talks together on the stage of the School of Visual Arts. And then started to spend more time together on this subject. That same year in '81 that his book came out, I gave my first conference talk, and I was now off and running. Got $100 for that talk. I was a professional, Daniel. And he started to get mail from people around the country and then around the world. I'm one of those people who doesn't keep digital records. I will admit it. I still have a dumb phone, folks. And that's fine with me. However, I have kept every date book I have ever had since the 1970s.
Wow.
So I can go back and tell you very often what I was doing on X day, 35 years ago. I could probably figure out when I started working for him. He needed help with the letters. Plus, I had already apprenticed for 3 well-known artists. I was very comfortable in the studio. All of them very distinguished. I guess the most famous of them was Adolf Gottlieb, a Jackson Pollock, de Kooning level abstract expressionist, which was a real feather in my cap. And so I kind of became his part-time studio assistant in his work. The years passed. we stayed close. And then in '87, he published what would be his biggest selling and most influential book, a book called Intruders.
Yeah.
The Visitation in Copley Woods, about a woman in Indiana who had repeated abduction experiences, but documented and backed up by the kind of evidence you'd find in courts of law. The year it came out, I had another experience that cemented my desire to commit myself to this work, which was '87 was the 40th anniversary of Roswell, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, so to say, which set the whole UFO thing in motion in 1947.
Yep.
And MUFON had a major conference in Washington, D.C. at American University. I was on a panel discussion there, and it was there that I heard still one of our most distinguished, now kind of a godfather of ufology, Stanton T. Friedman, a retired nuclear physicist now, who's semi-retired. He continues to speak, but not as much. He did a brilliant presentation called The Secret Life of Donald K. Menzel. Menzel was, if you look him up, he was the head of the astronomy department at Harvard. So he was a major academic and a major player in the field of space studies. Stan was the first person to really fully go through his available records, diving deep into the National Archives, everything on him, getting permission from his widow to see all his private papers. And there was one other area that he got into, I think the archives at Harvard. And what Stan was able to establish without any doubt was that Donald K. Menzel had lived a double life, that he was this distinguished Academy person who emerged as the first well-known UFO debunker. I'm a scientist, and I'm going to tell you why these things don't exist. I wrote several books about it. He was also essentially the mentor of a man named Philip Klass.
Yeah.
Who, as my sister used to describe him, Philip Klass, the man who has none, who went on to make a life of being a professional UFO denier, attacking the work we now know from getting into his archives and his private papers, that this was a kind of mean-spirited, vicious man whose fame in life, he was an editor at Aviation Weekly, so that gave him some credentials about UFOs, I don't think so, but he picked up and continued to publish and attack credible witnesses and so on. But I remember hearing the talk and thinking, this is exciting. I'm one of those people in the work that's as comfortable out there in the field, interviewing people that have had experiences or going to locations, documenting things, as comfortable as I am in a library or an archive or a newspaper morgue, digging up facts. It appeals to me. It's exciting. It's kind of quiet work and a little nerdy for some people, but I thought this paper inspired me, and that moved me along. At that point, Bud really needed a full-time, part-time person. And so from about there, right up until my sister Helen died, which completely knocked me out of the box in life for quite some time, this is what I did. I worked with him. And in that period of time, I had the privilege of assisting him in parts of, frankly, several hundred investigations. Also being a witness, either at his request with the acceptance of the witness, or at a witness's request with his okay of being the witness to hypnotic regressions, which I found a privilege and a serious responsibility and completely fascinating.
Sure.
Bud had suggested early on at one point that I should get my qualifications, study and learn, and be certified as a hypnotherapist, in great part because I had the right temperament for it, because I was dedicated to gaining knowledge. And I thought, I joked with him, I said, I remember you when your hair was all brown. You regularly sit 3 feet away from somebody often reliving their most terrifying, or in some cases, excited moments. I think it accelerates the aging process a little, quite simply. And frankly, I'm very happy being in a support position. I don't need to be Bud Hopkins. It's an honor being your assistant, and so that's how our relationship went. After about a year of mourning my sister, I started to creep out of the bomb crater that had been my life, reported back for work at a time when one of our other board members, we had a nonprofit foundation called the Intruders Foundation, had of course moved into my spot. Somebody had to fill that spot, and was now doing a superb job of it. And like me, taking pride in it, was like, I'm going to back off here. So for the last years of Bud's and my work relationship and friendship, we returned to colleagues who met at least once a month for the rest of our lives. I would still work in the studio. I would still help out as ever I could. And when his health started to decline in the last years, double up on it. We had some wonderful adventures together. In fact, the talk that you heard earlier in the week, that talking about working. But in the last years of his life, he died of cancer in August of 2011 at 80 years old. A very full life and a very fascinating life. It was such an incredible privilege and absolutely fascinating. Every inch of the way. There was no way to make a living. I managed to do that in other ways. I worked in theater management for years in New York, which I love. Jack of all trades in some degree, and picking up these modest ones as a speaker, selling articles, that kind of thing. Bud never took a penny from anybody for doing the work that he did. Like any professional speaker, he's paid for that. But that irritated me at a certain point because he was working so hard, and a very important person, often working with mental health professionals, medical people, working in tandem. A lot of these people took this subject seriously, but knew doing so publicly could jeopardize keeping their license to practice in their states.
Sure.
We worked together as much as we could on these things, and I still maintain a small network, but as far referral people in the profession. But I asked him why he didn't have a modest fee for his work, or even a sliding scale. And he said 2 reasons. You know me. I'm a humanist. I care about what's happened to these people. They come first. The knowledge that we're gaining is important, but we have a lot of people who are suffering, and I feel it's part of my responsibility to do it. The second reason, just as important on a certain level, was if people like Philip Klass knew that he had ever accepted a penny from somebody who thought they were taken by flying saucers, oh boy, this man is a total charlatan. He should be absolutely vilified by society. He's at worst, hypnotizing people and making them think to support some pathetic, sick, neurotic agenda of his own. It could have been very destructive, and I got him.
Yeah.
I followed in the same steps. I'm not a very practical person, but I'm always available for people who need to have a good listener, or maybe, when possible, a referral to somebody that can work with them professionally on this.
I think it's incredible to see that although, as you said, he's been so well known in this field and establishing himself as a predominant figure when it comes to the abduction phenomenon, but I don't think it could have happened without your support and with you there to really take, care and take the responsibility of following up with all of the different regressions and just being there at his side. I think it's important to acknowledge your part in all of that. So it's just amazing to see that you got to have a hand very close with everything that he was involved with.
Thank you, but I think you're being overly generous. I was proud of the good work that I did, but I'm confident that if it hadn't been me, somebody else would have been his Peter Robbins, so to say. It was not, again, I did have the right temperament for it. We were able to commune on a lot of levels. The fact that we both, the art world was so important to us. We were both big readers, loved the city of New York, and had similar senses of humor also. Bud's taste in music, as many of us, it's the music you grew up with. And for many of us, it also generally stops at a certain point. Bud's taste in music, with the exception of some Beatles songs, probably stopped at about 1960. But he grew up as a kid in the big band generation.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that early on got his admiration and affection for me and my parents, who adored him, was the fact that growing up with two parents who grew up in the big band era and loved that music and made me very familiar with it. There'd be like, okay, so who was the lead singer for the Dorsey Band in 1943 on this recording? I'd always get it right.
Yeah.
And that was just great fun. Well, thank you, though, for that.
That's excellent to know, because that's actually what I do, is I play in big bands. And so it's just a phenomenal experience. It's unlike any of the music we have today. It's such a classic type of American style, and I think it's just one of these amazing things that you see, in its own circle, but it's not so prominent now. It's just you have to really connect with it.
You bring up such an important thing as a professional musician, and I can say some of my best friends are musicians. One thing I occasionally run into with younger people, older people, doesn't matter, is this is my music and that's it. I was brought up, I was a member of all my high school choruses, was very fortunate as a kid to be taken to Broadway musicals and plays. I love so many kinds of music. I was a supernumerary at the Metropolitan Opera Company for a short period of time.
Oh, wow.
Worked, I will say, as a spear carrier in Aida opposite Luciano Pavarotti, me and him together.
Wow.
Yeah. But I grew up with soul, with classic rock and roll, with Motown, God bless it, with heavy metal, which I love. I'm a big Gilbert and Sullivan fan. I love opera. And then my sister in the 70s introduced me to punk. And that, what can I say? I think it's always a shame when people short-circuit themselves, and I am not even interested in listening to that stuff. When the world of popular culture is so broad and so wide, and we're all the happier, the better, the fuller for having an appreciation and enjoyment of different, and then of course there's world music, God knows, from different cultures, from different countries, from different times. Classical music, of course. Bud was like that too, but again, to a certain degree.
Sure, yeah. That's excellent. So, in closing, throughout the more recent years, you've lectured extensively on things like the ridicule factor, the appearance of UFO and pop culture, and all of these different issues which are so prevalent in our modern day scope of what we call ufology. So for those of our listeners and viewers who are interested, please share how we can look more further into your work.
How can I explain it? Unlike many of my colleagues who are brilliantly well organized, spot on about the subject, don't make posts on their Facebook page that don't relate to UFOs. For me, yes, I do that. I'm very outspoken politically. I love cats, so there's always going to be cats mixed in with the UFOs and my hatred of the current regime. Observations on human behavior. I have a website which is woefully needs updating, but anybody's welcome to visit. Peter Robbins, and that's ROBBINS NY.com. Contact me on Facebook. I'm available. Make friends, follow my posts. I always let people know where I'm going to be. If I have new things that I've written, let you know where you can read them. Or contact Daniel and get my email address from him. But I'm out there, and you can hear me speak, hear me on radio shows simply by Googling my name with UFO after it, or Wilhelm Reich after it, or James Forrestal after it, or just take an educated guess. Be aware, though, that there is another Peter Robbins out there, how dare they, who is better known than I for a very different reason, because he is the voice of the ongoing cartoon presence of Charlie Brown in all of the Peanuts specials. And several years ago, apparently he got into a bar fight and was briefly jailed.
Oh,
and
no.
I heard from every friend.
Oh, no.
Gee, I'm sorry for your trouble, wise guys. Also, if you go to YouTube, there are dozens of talks, lectures, radio interviews that you can audit for free and get an idea of the work that I do.
Excellent. So as a final statement, for those out there who think that UFOs are all imaginative and just nonsense and there's nothing to it, what would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, you have good reason to feel that way. Since 1947, Western culture has been conditioned to wire up the subject of having seen something in the sky you can't recognize as a conventional object with delusion, hoaxing, mysticism, a desire to be famous, to make money. It's so counterintuitive, and that didn't happen by accident. You can probably find a talk of mine on the origins of the ridicule factor, or how media have conspired to do this. And it all happened in the summer of 1947. It was brilliantly effective, and we're still living kind of in the wake of it. So it's understandable that you feel that way more, especially in the last decades when we human beings have more and more things up there that are almost like their stuff or science fiction-y at the least. I feel the overwhelming number of so-called UFO sightings are in fact explainable in non-exotic conventional terms. That understood, if you genuinely believe with all your heart that everything is explainable in conventional terms, that it's, a weak-minded, science fiction-oriented fantasy that we're not alone in the universe or not being visited, with respect, you're wrong. And there is myriads of the kind of evidence that could hang somebody in a court of law out there to audit. I would suggest to anybody that wants to challenge me on that you begin by Googling, say, authentic UFO documents. And you will start to find hundreds, if not thousands, of reproductions of fully authentic documents generated by different agencies and offices within the United States as well as other countries, and then start to build your library. I was an associate producer of a marvelous documentary a few years back of one of our finest cases, the case of a young blue-collar guy in Arizona named Travis Walton, who was part of a logging crew that encountered a fully articulated disc shape that knocked him unconscious and took him for 5 days. It's an hour-and-a-half documentary called Travis, the true story of Travis Walton, and it balances the science with the humanity, with extraordinary production values, taking you back to where it happened, analyzing the polygraphs, the physical evidence still available at the location itself in the Sitgraves National Forest. It's a good one to start with. And then you have so many television opportunities to see documentaries on the subject. Please understand there's a tremendous amount of crap out there. And with the advent of the internet, which is miraculous, kind of the godhead of every bit of information that we have now, how it works, I'm stymied. Some people say, well, we couldn't have done it without the aliens. Well, who knows? Bottom line, though, is an awful lot of the information being put forward is complete bull. And what it comes down to is the iconic X-Files poster, I want to believe, or I want to believe that this isn't. And a lot of us have a longing to be saved by a new pantheon of gods. God knows we have soiled our cage very badly here, and we probably won't be able to clean it up. So it's understandable that is that longing and that wish fulfillment, and that they're all good. Good and bad doesn't really enter into it. We're dealing with a myriad, I believe, of other intelligences that come and go with impunity for their own reasons, interact with humanity for their own reasons, and it keeps life very interesting. But we're not alone for sure, and it's an area worth studying.
Very well said. Well, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing, and we're looking forward to visiting with you here again soon.
I'd like that, Daniel. That's great.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the Vortex.